Welcome to this Master Gardeners of Nevada County workshop. Our topic today is nonstop gardening, growing vegetables year-round. Our speaker is Rob Chase, and Rob will introduce himself and begin our program now.
Thank you, Sylvia. My name is Rob Chase. I've been a master gardener in Nevada County for a little over 6 years now. Prior to that, I had a small organic farm in Connecticut for about 10 years, and I currently own a small organic farm as well here in Grass Valley. I worked with the master gardeners on the plant sales for about 5 years as a co-project lead, and I can't say enough about the resources that the master gardeners bring to the community. I really would encourage you to go on the website, to bring your questions to them through the access online, because somewhere within the organization, there's someone who has the answer. It's incredible, the body of knowledge that the master gardeners have as a group. So without further ado, my presentation is about nonstop gardening, and that means four-season vegetable gardening. That may sound like you're working all year round, but actually what I mean by four-season vegetable gardening is that you're harvesting year-round. Here's the website again for Master Gardeners. I like to start with a picture of the earth because it's important that we remind ourselves that this is it. This is all we've got. This is where everything we do is happening, and that the earth needs our help right now. So any efforts we can make to reduce our carbon footprint, to help reduce global warming, are steps in the right direction. And a lot of the local agricultural, the farmers and the research people at UC Davis and other universities are working diligently to reduce the carbon footprint that agriculture and gardening adds to the problem. Harvesting vegetables year-round is what we're talking about here. And why are we doing it? We're doing it because we can save money. We eat better. There's really nothing more pleasant than harvesting a fresh head of lettuce in the middle of January. It's a wonderful experience, and you can be eating fresh vegetables year-round out of your own garden. You will reduce your carbon footprint by growing your own food, and in these troubled times that we're surrounded with, it's wonderful to spend some time in the garden. Soothes the soul. So how do we do this? Well, planning is really key to success in growing vegetables year-round. And I'm going to go through the steps of planning. The way that we do it physically is by season extension. So essentially, we're stretching the seasons. We're stretching the end of the growing season in the summer through the fall and the winter. And we're starting earlier in the spring and getting things growing before we would normally think of having things growing in the spring. So it's basically we're pushing the envelope of seasons at both ends. And I would encourage anybody who's doing this to keep good records, because keeping records will help you make improvements year after year in the choices that you make, your timing, the amendments, your watering, and so on. So to get back to the seasons, the earth is tilted, and this is kind of, we all went through this in elementary school, but the earth is tilted on its axis 23.5 degrees. And what that does is, as the earth goes around the sun, during the winter, over here on the right, we're in the northern hemisphere tilted away from the sun. And so we have less solar energy during that period. And that's why we have winter. At the equinoxes, the earth is essentially, the tilt has no influence because the tilt is perpendicular basically to the light from the sun. And then in the summer, we're tilted toward the sun, and we get more solar energy. And that's why in the summer, we have hotter days, longer days, and so on. So the first thing you want to do when planning is make a map of your garden. If you have an existing garden, make a map of it. If you don't have a garden yet, you want to plan it, lay it out, and make a map of it once you've done that. The other thing that's part of planning is a calendar. Very, very important. You're going to want to put down some key dates, and your planting schedule is going to work around those key dates. And finally, in order to plan properly, you do need to do some work. You have to do some research and look at the plants that you're planning to grow and what their specific growing requirements are, and then plug that into your garden map and your calendar and come up with a overall plan for your garden. So if you don't have a garden already, if you're thinking about growing year-round, you want to think very carefully about how the sun affects the ability of you to grow in your garden. In the winter, the sun rises not nearly as high in the sky. As a matter of fact, at the solstice, the sun is only about 27.5 degrees above the horizon. At the summer solstice, it's closer to about 74 degrees. So you get much more solar energy in the summer. And in the winter, you get these long shadows because the sun is low in the sky. So when you're thinking about your garden, you want to think about where those shadows are going to be in the middle of winter, not just where they are in the summer. So obviously, on the north side of the house is not a great place for a garden. Any place that's in the shade of trees when the sun is low in the sky is not a great place. You want to try to find a location that's going to give you about 6 hours of sunlight, even in the middle of winter. You know, in the winter when it's raining, if it ever rains again, it's tedious to walk a long distance out to your garden to harvest. So if you do have a location close to your house, I would encourage you to put your garden within easy distance from the house so that you can walk out of the kitchen, harvest some herbs, harvest some greens, and walk right back in without having to tromp through the mud, fight the rain, and so on. So that's just when you're considering your options, accessibility is of some value. It will make you much happier over the years as you continue to work in your garden. We live in an area with a lot of hills, and cold air sinks, hot air rises. So those low areas on your property are going to be frost pockets. They're going to be colder. They won't warm up as quickly. They will tend to get frost sooner and later in the season. So you want to avoid those locations. And don't forget that a stand of trees can also create basically a blockade for cold air that's trying to sink and create a little mini frost pocket like you see up here on the side of this hill. So an open hilltop area is great. And you want to avoid these little cold microclimates. Don't forget, you may not need very much water in the winter, but you will want to have access to water. And don't forget to protect your water pipes if you're leaving the water on in the garden year round, especially, I mean, if you're in a place where freezes are common or happen at all. There's nothing more frustrating than a burst water pipe in the middle of a otherwise nice day. So your garden map, once you've figured out where your garden's going to go, how many beds you want, what size they're going to be, whether they're going to be raised beds or not. And I want to say, if you go to the Master Gardener website and you go to the online workshops that have been recorded, there is a workshop called Growing Cool Season Vegetables, which covers in great detail things like designing the beds, mulching the beds, building your soil, and so on. So I'm trying to avoid redundancy here, and I'm not going to go into great detail on some of those topics, but I would really encourage you to go online and look at those workshops. They're excellent workshops, and they have some great links also associated with them. So that's called the Growing Cool Season Vegetables workshop on the Master Gardener website. But this garden map, which is part of your planning tool, is very important in terms of as you work through the process of designing and determining what you're going to grow, where you're going to grow it, when you're planting, and so on. You want to make sure you know where north is, because the sun rises, the sun is shining from the south. So you want to know which direction the sun is going to be coming from. In the garden map, you want to label your beds. You want to note the dimensions of those beds so that you can plan the spacing of your plants and figure out how many plants will fit in each bed. And then you want to note any special considerations. Where's the water source? What areas might be shaded? Are these raised beds? Are they in-ground beds, etc.? So this is a map of my garden. And then I added this information to the map. So you can see that the larger beds are 4x16, the smaller beds are 4x8. The entire garden is fenced. There's a water source available within the fenced area, and we see where north is. So if I'm planning for plants that are tall and plants that are short, I may want to take into consideration the direction of the sun and where it's coming from. This is a valuable tool. I would suggest that you make a map like this, you leave it completely blank and save it, and then you can print it out and you can use it over and over and over again as you change what goes into each of the beds during each year and each season. So once you have your garden map, the next tool in your toolbox for planning is a calendar. And this is critical to putting together a plan for your garden. Now, I have to give credit where credit's due. Alita from Starbright Acres Family Farm told me when I asked her how she planned that she numbers her weeks from 1 to 52, so that rather than thinking about, oh, I've got to do something on March 3rd or what's going on April 15th, it's week by week. So, you know, what's going on week 30? What's going on week 35? And what's great about that is that it's consistent year to year. So you don't have to think about the dates. You're just saying on week 3, this is what I do. On week 12, this is what I do. Very helpful way to think about planning on the calendar. Almost all of your planting is going to revolve around the frost dates. You know, the last frost in the early spring, the first frost in the fall. And so you want to make sure that you get those frost dates and get them on your calendar. The Persephone period is something, it's a term that Elliot Coleman coined. And basically, the Persephone period is that time of the winter when we get less than 10 hours of sun each day. During that period, plants basically are going into a state of suspended animation. And so when you're planning for your winter harvest, you need to make sure that by the beginning of the Persephone period, the plants have reached adequate maturity that going into a kind of suspended animation is okay. Then you'll have a buffet in the garden, basically, that you can harvest for the remainder of the winter. I like to add the solstice and the equinox just because on the day of the solstice, I like to look up and see exactly how high the sun is in the sky or how low it is. And I like to follow the sun going directly overhead on the equinox. Your hardiness zone, your hardiness zone may come into play when you're gathering information about the plants. And so some of your seed packs or other research that you do on particular varieties of plants are going to tell you whether they're suitable for a particular hardiness zone or not. So it's good to know what your hardiness zone is. And again, more for just wonkiness than anything else, it's nice to know what your latitude is. We're at about 39 degrees north here. And so that determines how high in the sky the sun is going to get both in the summer and the winter and throughout the year. So it's nice to know what your latitude is for planning. So get yourself a calendar. It really doesn't matter what kind of calendar. You can get a desktop or a large wall calendar, a weekly planner. And there are even some books you see down here on the left. There's some books you can buy that have basically week by week diaries that you can enter what you did in a particular year. And that's quite handy also. But whatever you use for a calendar, get one, dedicate it to your garden, and then we're going to enter the information. So you're numbering your weeks. You see we have the numbers along the side here. So those are the weeks of the year. And you don't have to worry about all these websites because they will be on a link associated with this workshop on our website. So don't scramble to write all these down. They'll be there for you. But there are a number of sites that you can use to help you find these dates. So Plant Maps and davesgarden.com will give you the dates. You plug in your address and they will give you the dates of your first and last frosts that you can then put into your calendar. So you put in your frost dates, and then you're going to find your Persephone period. And this is, like I said, the time when the day length is 10 hours or less. This is a neat site. You put in your location, and if you see this vertical double white line here on the graph, you can slide that left and right. And as you slide it, this number down here, which is total daylight hours, will change. So you just slide it until it goes to 10, and that gives you your Persephone date. And you can slide it down to the other end of the scale and get the end of your Persephone date sometime in January here. So it's a good, interesting tool and easy way to find out your daylight hours at your location. Then you put those in your calendar. And then if you want to find the solstice and the equinox, they're basically on the same days every year. But if you're a geek and you want to know exactly what time the solstice is or what time the equinox is, this site will give you the exact date and time for each of those during the year. I like to put those in. And then the USDA has a plant hardiness map. And you can just basically zoom in on the map, and based on the color code, it tells you what your hardiness zone is. So for me, for instance, I'm in 9A, which means that in most years, the temperature is going to get as low as 20 to 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Good to know.
Rob, just a quick interruption.
Yes.
Forgive me if you mentioned this and I missed it, but I want to let everyone know that you've prepared a handout that has these URLs and other resources, and it's going to be available online with the recording of this workshop. So they don't have to worry about trying to scribble those down as you go through.
Yeah, I did mention that.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So finding your latitude, if you're familiar with Google Maps, if you create a little flag for a location on Google Maps and then right click on it, it will give you the latitude and longitude here. So you can find your exact latitude and longitude. So once you have your calendar with all these key dates on it, you want to do some research. And that means seed catalogs, seed packs, online. There's books, different planners that are available online. These are all the things you're going to use to determine when is the appropriate time to plant a specific plant that you want to grow, and you know what the requirements are going to be so that you can plug it into the calendar and figure out what your planting schedule is. So if you go into seed catalogs, frequently they have really valuable information. This is this field tomatoes is out of Johnny's Seeds. And they have detailed growing information for every single vegetable seed that they sell. This is their entry about spinach. And then on most seed packs, you're going to find also very valuable information. They don't put this stuff here just to fill up space on the package. It's there because it gives you valuable information that you need to know. So for instance, on this San Marzano tomato here, it says in early spring, start indoors about 6 to 8 weeks before outdoor night temperatures are reliably in the 50 to 55 degree Fahrenheit range. Well, we know the last frost date. We might guess, when that air temperature is going to get up to about there. And then on your calendar, go back 6 to 8 weeks, and you're going to start those seeds indoors so that they're ready to plant out at the appropriate time. And it gives you other information about how deep to seed them, how far apart to space them, and so on. So this is all valuable information. Online resources. The Master Gardener website has workshops, and in the workshops, there are links to many other useful sources of information. And there are other links on the website that will help you to find information that you need about the different plants you want to grow. And I'd just like to say, when you're thinking about what you want to grow, the first thing you want to do is think about what you like to eat. So look in the catalogs, maybe make a list of your favorite foods. Think about what is a cool weather plant and what's a warm weather plant, so that you're spreading your selection across the entire year. But and then maybe try some things that you haven't tried before. But I always encourage people to grow things that they like to eat, because that just makes the whole experience that much better. There's another great website. This is part of the UC Agriculture and A&R. Natural Resources. So this is research-based information, and in this website, they have a list of almost every vegetable that you'd want to grow, and then detailed publications that you can download about growing those things. So here's their little flyer about spinach, and then there's a 3 or 4 page article about growing tomatoes. And you can find, if you go to that website, they have squash, watermelon, lettuce, everything. It's a wonderful resource. The other place to look is books. There are a lot of good books out there that have great information about growing. This excerpt on the right here is out of The Market Gardener by Jean-Martin Fortier, which is one of my favorite go-to books right now. And one of the things that's nice about it, if you look at this blurry image of spinach over here, you'll see that there's a little snowflake. That's indicating that it's a cool weather crop. So when you're trying to select your crops for cool weather, it's very simple to go through his book and just look for the snowflakes, and that gives you an idea of which plants might be appropriate for your cool weather seasons. Also, up here you'll see he indicates exactly the dates of his succession plantings, which may not match up exactly with your dates, but it gives you an idea of how many succession plantings you might want to have in order to have a continuous supply of this plant. Elliot Coleman's books are very useful. He's been an advocate of 4-season growing for a long time, and there's lots of great information in these books. I also include references to these books in that handout that's going to be linked to the workshop. This week-by-week Vegetable Gardener's Handbook is kind of an interesting and different approach to planning. It actually has a week-by-week task list of what to start, what to plant, what to do, clean your tools, clean the barn, And so if you don't want to go through the process of all the research and you just want to get started, you could start with this book, and it'll give you a really good idea of maybe some choices that you want to make and some scheduling. And it's those dates and planting dates are based around your frost date, not any date in the book. Then you can go online and find planners. And these planners allow you to plug in your frost date, and then they tell you when you should either direct seed or transplant various crops. So Johnny's has some great online planners. I think if you just type in planting planners, you'll get a whole slew of different planners that are available online. I would encourage you, when looking for information like this, or anytime you're searching online, to look for .edu sites first, because those are going to be university research-based information. .org is kind of my second go-to site if I see a .org site. And then a lot of the large seed manufacturers and growers and nurseries have also very interesting tools and so on that are available online. My last place would be, George's Backyard Garden YouTube, recommending that you put Doublemint gum in the hole or something to keep the gophers away. So try to stick with science-based research when you're searching for these tools. This planner over here is available. It's from the Nevada County Master Gardeners, and it has a lot of information about when to plant and soil requirement, temperature requirements, and so on. This is the Johnny's one here. I'm not sure where I got this one. It might have been out of the Old Farmer's Almanac. And then this is my planner that I've developed. If you do have talents in Excel and you want to develop your own planner, I would encourage you to find planners online and then start to develop your own planner that has the things you want to grow, your specific dates and requirements, and so on. But this is how you start to plug these dates into your calendar. You put in your frost date, and it says if your frost date is 10/18/22, that would be the first frost date. You're going to want to get your beets in the ground by August 6th. And you can just take these dates and start out experimenting with them. And by keeping good records, you'll say, oh, I planted those too early last year. I'm going to move them a little later next year, or I'm going to move them a little earlier. So you learn from your own experience and your own exact microclimate what works and what doesn't work. So putting it all together is basically plugging these things into your planner if you have one, or just onto the calendar if you want to, and onto your garden map. And it's going to revolve around the research you've done. So you've looked at your seed catalogs, you've looked at the seed packages, the dates that you put on your calendar, your local climate, the season that you're in, and what you like to eat. So we think of the seasons normally as spring, summer, fall, and winter. But in the garden, I think of the seasons a little bit differently. There are a lot of mini seasons in the garden. So we have early spring, mid-spring, all of these. But when it comes to planting, I kind of boil these down to early spring, which is where we are right now, spring, summer, which is kind of the traditional gardening period. That's what most people are familiar with when they think of a garden. We're talking tomatoes and squash and eggplant and peppers. It's warm weather, long days. And then late summer and early fall is a period when you can plant things that will grow to the point where you can continue to harvest them all winter long. And then late fall and overwintering is a much neglected growing period. And what you're doing here is basically planting things that will come up in the spring. So you're not harvesting them in the winter, but what you're doing is getting a jump on spring by getting them in the ground in the late fall, so that when the weather starts to warm up, just like that volunteer arugula that shows up in your bed every year, they start to grow right away as soon as conditions allow. So early spring is cool weather crops. Most of them are going to mature before the summer heat comes along, or they're going to benefit from an early start. And these are some of the crops that you might be growing this time of year. And that's where we are right now. So peas, beets, cabbage, cauliflower. These are all plants that are like right now, good time to be planting for those. The information that's going to be important about when you either start them inside or plant them out is when is our last frost date. So for me, where I am, it's May 11th. And those are all just estimates. Obviously, we've had some years when we've had snow after May 11th. And some years, the last frost date may be in April. But on average, you're pretty safe after May 11th at my location as a last frost date. So I use that for my planning. And then the other information that you might want to keep track of is, what is the overnight low temperature? Not just the frost date, but, as the temperature starts to warm up, what is that overnight low? And check the temperature of your soil once in a while. A lot of these plants, not so much the cool weather plants, but when you get more into the spring and summer, the soil temperature is very important in spurring their growth. So spring and summer, this is our warm weather crops, our traditional summer garden. You can get an early start with many of those by providing protection for them and getting your tomatoes before all your neighbors. They need a warmer soil temperature and overnight lows that are above, say, 45 or 55, depending on the plant. And these are some of the crops that we're talking about in this spring-summer time period. So late summer and early fall, we're going back to our cool weather crops. And these are the ones that we're going to start in late summer and early fall so that they reach a level of maturity prior to the Persephone period, say 75% maturity or so before Persephone kicks in, so that they go into a kind of a suspended animation in the garden, and you can harvest them all through the fall, through the winter. You should be harvesting lettuce right through until your new arugula that you planted for overwintering comes up, or your spinach. So there's no reason that you have to have any kind of a gap at all in nice fresh produce out of your garden. You want to plant succession plantings so that they're maturing at different rates, and you can harvest the more mature ones first. And in this time of year, when you're first planting your seedlings, if you're doing transplants, you're probably going to be protecting them from the heat. And then as the season progresses and you get closer to winter, you're going to be protecting them from the cold, which is exactly the opposite of what happens at the other end of the year when you're protecting them from cold right now, and then from heat as you get into the summer. So these are some of the cold weather crops that you might want to plant in the late summer and early fall. And the Persephone period comes into play here because, as I said, you want to make sure that you start your plants so that they reach a level of maturity before Persephone kicks in, that you'll be able to actually harvest and eat them. So overwintering, you're planting in late fall, and what you want to do is just get some early growth, get these plants established, and then protect them from freezing over the winter. And then as the weather warms up, these plants will wake up and just take off before anything that you might direct seed in the early spring would be starting to grow. And here's a list of some of the plants that are appropriate for overwintering. So we talk about cool season vegetables, and this is covered very well in the growing cool season vegetables workshop. But I just want to go over it a little bit here. Cool season vegetables grow best between 55 and 75 degrees. So these are the plants that we're planting now before we get into the summer heat, and they're the ones that we're planting in the late summer and early fall as the heat is diminishing and we're getting back into the cool weather. Many of them tolerate some frost. Some of them actually tolerate a pretty hard freeze. Kale, for instance, can tolerate a real snow and cold weather. But most of them can tolerate some level of frost when they're mature. Often the nutritional value is higher in these plants because we're eating the roots, the stems, and the leaves, as opposed to the berries and the fruits that we might be eating in the summer. Many of these plants will sweeten up as they get exposed to frost, and the reason for that is quite interesting. Basically, what they're doing is injecting sugar into their cells, kind of like antifreeze, to protect them against their cells bursting because the weather is cold and freezing. So you can think of the sweetness that comes into these plants as their antifreeze to protect them against the cold weather, and we get the benefit of a sweeter product at the end. So some of these are, kale is one of my favorites. It comes in so many different varieties. It's very hardy. It's easy to grow. That's an overwintered kale that's out of control, but you can see it's that was in the middle of winter in Connecticut, and it was handling it quite well. Arugula is another great cold weather crop. Garlic is a little unusual. We plant garlic in the fall, usually in November, and we actually don't harvest garlic until the following June or thereabouts in the summer. But it is an overwintering crop. So for instance, garlic is in the ground right now and it's sprouted, but it's going to continue to grow right through the winter and the spring and into midsummer. And that's when we actually harvest it. Lettuce and cilantro are great, and you can grow them together in the same bed. And this is midwinter. We just go out and harvest those nice butterhead lettuces and grab a little cilantro. Mizuna is overlooked frequently, but it's a great green. It's very easy to grow. It's attractive in a salad. So that's another plant that you can grow through the winter. Endive. And you can see that, so this is a head of lettuce that was not protected, and it had a light snow frost that landed on it. The key with a situation like this is you don't want to harvest this head until the sun has come out, the frost has melted, and the plant has recovered, because if you handle it when it has this frost on it, it will get damaged. But it'll survive this very nicely without any damage, and will continue to be an edible head of lettuce. This is the planting template that's on the UCANR website, and I just wanted to put it up here so that you can see. If you go and download this, it gives you a lot of useful information about when to plant things, what temperatures they're looking for, and so on. So how do you get started with this? I think you want to pick a season and just get started with that season. So right now we're in early spring. We're in week 6, if you're counting weeks. And you want to start asking questions like, what plants are appropriate for the season? So right now we're looking at the early spring cool weather plants. Are we going to direct seed these plants, or are we going to grow them inside and then transplant them? Look at the seed packs, the information in the catalogs. How many days does it take between the time you plant the seed and the time it's ready to transplant? Because you're going to want to work backwards from that transplant date to figure out when to start the seeds. Does the information that you've gathered give you any idea of the relationship to the frost date? Some plants you can plant out a week or two before the last frost. Some you may want to wait until after the frost date. But you get that information, and then that's going to give you the way to calculate where on the calendar you're going to place the seeding and the transplanting of these different plants. And you might be curious to know how many days it's going to take from the time you transplant it to the time you begin to harvest, especially if you're planting your garden with the intention of always having fresh produce coming out of the garden. That's also part of your succession planting planning is if you're going to plant some, let's say heads of lettuce or spinach or something that are going to mature and you want to harvest them all, you might want to plant them every couple of weeks during the appropriate season so that you have a continual flow of mature plants to harvest. And you may not care, but it's kind of interesting to know how much you can expect to get out of each plant, each head of lettuce, each spinach plant. And it's very important to know how far apart in the bed the rows will be and how far apart the plants will be spaced within each row. So for instance, if you have a 4x8 bed and the seed pack indicates that you can plant them 8 inches on center in every direction, you might be able to fit 6 rows of 11 plants each in a 4x8 bed, giving you 66 heads of lettuce in a single 4x8 bed. Pretty cool, especially if you're doing that and it's just going to be sitting there waiting for you like a buffet all winter long. So that's the kind of information you need to gather together. Pick your season and start plugging these things into your planner, into your calendar. So you want to read the seed pack, read the seed catalog, do your book research, look online for sources of information, and put that all together to determine how much and when you're going to grow each variety that you've selected. So you're going to figure out those dates. You're going to enter them on the calendar. You want to figure out how many plants you want to grow. And then you have to translate that into how much space they're going to take up in the garden. So like I said, if you've got 8-inch on center and you have a 4x8 bed, you're going to get 66 plants in that bed. How many do you want? And do you want to divide that bed in half and do 33 of one thing and 33 of something else? But especially if you have a small garden and limited space, you need to plan ahead and figure out how much space each plant that you're growing is going to take up in the garden. And that's a function of the distance between the rows and the spacing between the plants within each row. And a lot of these books and seed packs and catalogs and so on will give you that information. So then you figure out what plants go in each bed, maybe taking into consideration the shading that tall plants are going to put on smaller plants. So if you're doing this multi-year, you want to plan a rotation, so you're not planting the same family of plants in each bed each year. And then you're going to plug them into your map. So now you have a map that shows you what's going to go in your garden, when you're planting it, and how much you expect to get out of that plan. Once you've figured all that out, and I know this seems like a lot of work, and it is a lot of work, but it's worth it. You need to figure out how many seeds do I need to buy, how much soil am I going to need to start these seeds, how many flats or pots am I going to need? Do I need to start these indoors? Do I have a place indoors where I can put them, or do I need to get some heat mats and some artificial light? And then, when you're planting tomatoes, for instance, in the spring, you may be starting them in a 50-cell tray and then transplanting them up to a 4-inch pot before they go out into the garden. So you need to figure out how many of those pots you're going to need and how much potting soil that's going to take. And then you want to think about your beds. If your beds were left uncleaned after last year, you want to go out there and clean up weeds, get the debris out of the way, maybe put some fertilizer in and turn it in so that it gets incorporated into the soil a little bit before you start planting. Figure out how you're going to irrigate, what your mulching requirements might be, and so on. And then you have to buy everything. So just going to order all that stuff and make sure that you get it in time so that you don't miss your dates. So like I said, we're in early spring. We're in week 6. We're about 14 to 13 weeks before the last frost date. And so right now I should be starting my collards, my kale, my lettuce, my cauliflower, all those plants indoors to be transplanted out once things warm up just a little bit. Some things I've already planted. I have some onions started, some leeks, some oregano, some chives, some basil, some parsley. And, you know, if you don't want to make the effort to start your own plants indoors, there are plenty of great nurseries, garden centers, and farmers around here who grow starts for sale at the appropriate times. So if you're concerned about the time and effort involved in starting these things indoors, just look at the transplant date and then buy your transplants at the appropriate time. And you can just take those and transplant them right out into the garden without having to go through the process of starting them yourself. I will say, though, starting plants from seed is a really, really rewarding experience. And I hope that you try it. You know, start with something simple. Lettuce comes up in about 3 days at the right temperature. It's really easy. Tomatoes are pretty tolerant and can be started easily and then potted up and transplanted outdoors. So I would encourage you to experiment. Even if you don't grow everything yourself, try starting a few things yourself. So you may need to lay out the beds if you don't have a garden set up already. And now is a good time to do that. Just put some stakes in the ground and stretch the strings and figure out where everything's going to go. You want to get those weeds out, remove the debris, like I said. You want to add some, you know, if you need to add calcium or some fertilizer, some compost. And this building of the soil is covered very, very thoroughly in that cool season vegetables workshop. So once again, I would encourage you, when we're talking about building up the soil quality and designing and constructing your beds, to go to that workshop as a reference for some great information. You don't want to be working in the beds if they're still wet, if they're too wet. So, but if they aren't, you can put some of these amendments and compost on top of the beds and just turn them in lightly so that they get mixed in with the soil. You want to think about how you're going to be watering your garden once everything is planted. I prefer drip systems for most of my beds. It's much easier. It actually uses far less water, and it looks like we may be in for an extended drought here again. So drip systems are very water wise. And if you want to get a little fancier, it's nice to have timers on your watering so that you can water early in the morning when it's cool and the water won't evaporate. And it's also a good time to look at your tools and make sure that those are all ready to go. So I want to talk a little about overwintering, because that is a topic that is, like I said, it's neglected and also was not covered in the cool season vegetables workshop. So I thought it would be good to talk about overwintering a little bit. And this is from the Johnny's Winter Growing Guide, which is an excellent guide you can download off their site. This is their definition of overwintering. So what you're doing is basically getting these little plants started and protecting them through the winter so that they just burst into growth in the spring. So like I said before, you're going to plant them in late fall. We're going to protect them with low tunnels, which I'll cover in a little bit. And AG19 is agricultural fabric. It's a lightweight fabric that I'll also describe in a little more detail in a few minutes. When overwintering, you might want to even put plastic over your low tunnels during the coldest part of winter. You really don't need to get into them, so you can just cover them up. And if you get a sunny day and they seems to be too warm, you can ventilate just by opening the ends. And then after the last frost, you're going to take the plastic off. And lo and behold, in early spring, like right now, you're going to have beds full of ready to eat greens and vegetables. So these are the tier 1 is the easiest overwintering crops to grow. Spinach is kind of the king of overwintering. It's a great crop to try. Kale is great. Tatsoi is absolutely wonderful. It's a mustard plant. And Claytonia is what we know as miner's lettuce. And it also is hardy and will grow through the winter and survive. Next level are these plants. And then the hardest ones to grow for overwintering are these at the end. But I have to say I've had a lot of success with lettuce and chard. I have chard growing out in the field in the open right now, and it's doing very well in spite of the 2 feet of snow that we had. But these are the kinds of things that you might want to plant late fall, get them started, protect them, and then in the early spring, you're going to be harvesting them before anybody else has these fresh greens coming out of the garden. So in the Johnny's growing guide, there's this chart which shows you a guide for when to plant and whether to transplant or direct seed. So it's another resource you can look at. So how do we accomplish this? I keep talking about protecting the plants during these cold seasons. And there are really 2 ways to extend the season. One is to actually control the climate, and that takes active measures. It uses energy, but it's very effective. And the other is kind of passive protection, which provides pretty much all you need, I think, in this area, unless you're really trying to push the envelope. So climate control also includes starting your seeds indoors, because you're creating an artificial environment that's going to get them going at the temperatures that they like and that will get them germinating. This book, The Seed Starter's Handbook by Nancy Bubel, has absolutely fantastic information about starting every single seed you might want to, every single vegetable you might want to start. And what's interesting, if you look at this chart, it gives you the minimum, the optimum, the actual optimum, and the maximum. So if you try to grow, let's say you want to start eggplant, the seeds aren't going to germinate below 60 degrees. From 65 to 95, they'll germinate, but the optimum temperature for germination for eggplant is 95 degrees. That's the soil temperature you're looking for when you're putting those seeds in. If the temperature exceeds 105 degrees, you're going to kill those little seedlings. So this gives you a real guide for a target for when you're starting seeds indoors, if you're able to control that temperature. This chart tells you at what temperature, how many days it will take for those seedlings to emerge at different temperatures. So eggplant at the optimum temperature, 86 to 95 here, they're going to sprout in a little over 5 days. At 68 degrees, it's going to take 2 weeks for those sprouts to come up. So this just helps you in your planning. If you don't have or don't want to buy heat mats or create the environment indoors that's going to create the optimum temperature, let's say you're just putting them inside the house by a south-facing window. Maybe your house is at 68 degrees. So you can look down here and get an idea of how many days it's going to take for these things to actually emerge and sprout. So you don't have to get worried until those dates pass and you don't have anything coming up. But if you do want to create a controlled environment for your seedlings, you can start an awful lot of seedlings on a single heat mat. So if this mat, I think, holds 4 or 5 trays. And each tray maybe holds 50 starts in it. And if you're using open flats and sprinkling seed closer together, you can get even more plants started on a mat like this. So this mat can be controlled. You have you use a thermostat that has a probe that goes into the soil, and you set the temperature that you want. So for that eggplant, maybe I would set it to 85 or 90. Put the probe into the soil, and when the soil temperature hits 85 or 90 degrees, the thermostat will turn off the heat mat so it doesn't cook the plants. When it drops below that set temperature, the heat mat will come back on and keep them at the ideal temperature. So that allows you to really maximize your germination of your plants. I built this propagation table. It's really sort of a chamber. And what it is, it's an insulated box with sand in the bottom of it and a heating coil, and then another layer of sand, and then a layer of screen on top of that. And this little table, I can put 12 flats in there, and a heating coil is a much less expensive investment than a heat mat. You can buy a heat coil that will do this entire table for about $30 or so. And you see the little thermostat down here at the bottom. So you set the temperature, the probe is going in here and into the soil, into the sand. And you put your flats in there, you keep the sand moist, and plants germinate beautifully in here. And the top is a layer of the double-walled polycarbonate, which provides also some insulation. So the whole thing is a big insulated box, and you can control the temperature and the humidity by moistening the sand. So you do need to maintain humidity on your starts. It can be as simple as just spray bottles and watering cans. This is an ebb and flow system that I experimented with, which didn't work great, but was fun. So it can be complicated. You want it to be. And domes are great. You know, if you get some domes and you put them over your flats, that's going to retain the moisture. And you do need to watch for damping off, which is a fungal disease that can affect your seedlings if they get too wet. But domes are a great way to maintain moisture, and you just have to monitor your little seedlings as you're growing them. So once they come up, you're going to take those covers off and you're going to put them under lights. And you want to keep those lights pretty close to those plants so they don't get leggy. And this is better use of a bathtub than taking a bath. You can see the lights and the plants in there growing. So this is in preparation for potting them up and then eventually transplanting them out into the garden. So another method of climate control is the greenhouse. And greenhouse generally has fans that control the movement of air and can cool the greenhouse when it gets too hot. It has heaters in the cooler part of the year that keep it up to the temperature that you want. And if you want to invest in a greenhouse, it's a great way to control that environment for either starting your plants or even growing some things in containers throughout the year. But remember that you're paying for heat and electricity to maintain this climate. So there is a cost associated with it, and it does increase your carbon footprint. This is an attached greenhouse that I had on my house in Connecticut. And what was nice about this, you can see the snow outside and the plants are doing quite well indoors. I had a little propane heater in there. And because it was attached to the side of my house, I was able to take advantage of the heat from the greenhouse during the day. And I was able to sort of balance the heat in the greenhouse at night by leaving the windows open into the inside of the house. So it's another option that is not quite as expensive as one of those large fancy greenhouses. So the other way to provide season extension is by providing protection without having to use any additional energy. So in the summer, for instance, shade cloth is a great way to protect things from too much heat. And you can use shade cloth over any of the other protection techniques that we're going to talk about if you have a situation where you want to cut down on the heat gain in the hotter part of the year. This is a mulched garlic bed. in the middle of winter. Usually, if we're growing things in the winter, we want the beds to be exposed so that they capture as much of the heat from the sun as possible. But this mulch is there to protect the small growing garlic plants from freezing. But this is a straw mulch. It's rice straw, so it's not going to add any weeds to the garden beds because it has no seeds in it, and it decomposes eventually and becomes part of the organic matter that you're adding to the bed. So it's a great addition and a great solution for mulch when you need mulch. I sometimes use plastic mulch. I'm trying to get away from it, but it does provide tremendous weed prevention, protection, and gets the heat in the soil early if you're putting plants out in the early spring. You can see the garlic over on the right in this picture. That's the garlic that was mulched in the previous photograph. So that's what it looks like as we're getting closer to late spring and early summer. A classic way to protect plants from cold weather is a cold frame. And this can be as simple as just some old window frames on top of concrete blocks like you see in the top of this picture. Or you can build a enclosure that sits on top of your raised bed and then can be removed when the weather warms up. You do need to provide for ventilation so that when you have a hot day, you're not cooking your plants in there. And this is a real ventilation. You can tip the whole thing open and let the warm air out and let the sun in. So cold frames are great. They're inexpensive and they work very, very well for particularly early season starts, protecting plants from those last cold frosts that they're going to get in the early spring. Floating row covers have become very, very popular. This is the agricultural fabric I was talking about. This is AG19. It's a lightweight spun fabric. It's not very expensive. And you can place it over a growing crop. And believe it or not, the plants will just push up against it. And with the exception of a couple of varieties of things like spinach doesn't like to have its leaves touched by this, but many things can be grown directly underneath a floating row cover. It's very lightweight, and it will provide an increase of 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit over the plants that are exposed around it. It has the added benefit of preventing the incursion of early insects into your garden beds when you're first putting things out there. So this time of year, you know, when you're putting your plants out, if you put a floating row cover over them, it's also going to minimize the insect pest problem that you might have. The next step up from floating row covers is called low tunnels, for obvious reasons. These tunnels are made out of EMT pipe, 3/4 inch EMT pipe that you buy in a 10-foot length, and they're staked into the ground. They just sleeve over sections of 1/2 inch EMT pipe that are pounded into the ground along the bed. So they provide kind of a Conestoga wagon look. But what's nice about them, it keeps the fabric off the leaves of the plants. And it's very, very easy to access them for harvest or for weeding or watering or anything else you might want to do. You can buy inexpensive benders that will make this curve in the pipe, specifically for a 4-foot bed like this. And maybe you know somebody who has a pipe bender, a local plumber or electrician or something, and you may be able to borrow it and make these yourself. But this low tunnel is another great way to protect your crops, both in the fall and in the early spring. So on sunny days, maybe you open it up, and then at night, when it's going to get cold, you just drop those sides down and put those spring clips on, and it's going to protect them from frost and provide them with some extra heat overnight. If you have a really sunny day, you can just open them right up and let the sun get in there and help those plants grow. So the next step up from a low tunnel is what we call a caterpillar tunnel. And these are kind of an inexpensive version of a hoop house. Usually the hoops are made out of just PVC plastic or some other inexpensive hoop material. And you can see that the plastic itself is not high quality greenhouse plastic. But a caterpillar tunnel is tall enough that you can get inside and work. And it will cover probably 4 beds in a normal size garden. So you might want to consider this if you're really getting into cool weather growing. And it's an inexpensive way to provide a large area of protection that you can still have reasonably easy access to get to. And finally, we have high tunnels and hoop houses. These are more permanent structures, steel frames, usually permanent placement in the ground. And these don't have active heating and cooling measures, but they have roll-up sides, roll-up fronts, so you can control the heat and the cool inside these hoop houses simply by rolling the sides up and down. And it's possible, of course, to add a heater in the early part of the year if you need to, but the whole idea of a hoop house is we're getting away from controlling the climate with energy using equipment and taking advantage of sunlight and natural air movement to provide an environment that gets us an early start or extends the season at the end. You can also combine these protection tricks. So these are some cold frames that are inside a high tunnel, and that really gives you double protection. There are a lot of people now who are not using quite such a permanent structure for a cold frame inside, but just draping that agricultural fabric over some wire hoops inside a high tunnel to give you that double protection that will keep your plants growing throughout the winter. So finally, record keeping. It's really important to keep track of what you do so that you can make changes and improve and learn from what you do right and what you do wrong. So I think keeping track of seed starting, when you plant your seeds, what seeds you planted, where they came from, what year they were. We number our flats just so that it's easy to keep track of them. And you want to keep track of how many you planted so that you can see your germination rate. And if you have multiple people planting, it's a good idea to initial who did what, so that if you have any questions, you can go ask, did you really plant? Is that eggplant? Because it doesn't look like eggplant. And then you want to keep track of potting up. When do you actually pot up to larger pots for your plants that get potted up? When do you transplant them to the field? Which beds do they go into? How many did you transplant? What was the date you did it? And then the same thing with direct seeding in the garden. So what date did I plant them? What seeds did I use? Where did I plant them? And how many did I plant? Those records are going to be invaluable to you as you're planning for the next season. So this is an example of one seeding record from our farm, and you can see it's kind of a mess. We add to it and so on, but then I take all this information and put it into an Excel spreadsheet, so it becomes very clear. But just printing out a blank log is a great way to keep track of this stuff. And then here's the garden map with all the stuff written down on it, what goes where, how many. And this is, the sort of actual as opposed to the original plan. You want to also keep track of any amendments that you add. So if you're fertilizing, if you're adding compost, where did you put it? When did you put it down? How much did you put down? And so on. When you're watering, many of the questions that we get at the Master Gardeners are about, how much should I water? Well, if you keep track of how much you water, and it's very easy you can buy inexpensive water meters that go right onto a hose, and you can keep track of how many gallons you water, when you water. And if you feel that you're overwatering, you can make adjustments. If you feel that you're underwatering, you can make adjustments. But if you don't keep track of it, it's just, you're just guessing. So keep track of when you water and how frequently and how much. The protection that you provide, when did you uncover those plants? When was it too early? Did it turn out to be too late? Were they getting too hot? So good idea just to write down when you remove the cover off your plants. And then, of course, when you harvest, if you're interested, it's a good idea to keep track of the date that you harvested, how much you harvested. And then, if you end up with so many tomatoes that your pantry is full of tomato sauce, you may want to think next year about not planting quite so many tomatoes, or vice versa. So these are some of the books that I've mentioned. All this information is in the handout that's going to be attached to the workshop. But I would encourage you to do as much research as you can as you're planning, and ask questions and send questions in to the Master Gardeners, and we'll try to help answer them. And that's it. I like this poem because it reminds me of why we're doing all this. I think it's a really great expression of what it means to be a gardener. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob. Now, on to questions. The first question I have is, how long do seed packets last?
Ooh. Well, as Master Gardeners like to say, it all depends. Different types of plants have different longevity in the seed packs. So, for instance, squash, cucumbers, those kinds of plants, those seeds basically, if they're more than a year old and they haven't been cared for really, really well, I wouldn't even bother with them. Peppers and tomatoes tend to last much longer. And, each different type of plant, the seeds are going to last really based on two factors. It's the nature of the seed itself, and also how well it is stored. So for instance, I took an old wine cooler, and that's where I store my seeds, and I keep them at about, I don't know, it's probably 42 degrees, something like that. And they stay at that consistent temperature whenever they're not actually being taken out to be used. But in general, you're going to get a lower germination rate the older the seeds are. So I would encourage you, if you have old seed packets, to take some out, put them in a paper towel, get it wet, put it somewhere where they're likely to germinate, and get some idea what your germination rate is going to be, and then overplant those seeds. So if you're planting older seeds, maybe you want to put 3 or 4 seeds in each cell when you're planting in a flat, or plant many more than you think you actually need if the seeds are older. But like I said, things like squash and cucumbers and large kind of seeds that have a large moist area in them do not really survive very well from year to year. So you're better off trying the hard-shelled small seeds, peppers, tomatoes, and so on. Those can last quite a while. If you like, I can bring up some of those websites that we talked about. So this is the Nevada County website, Master Gardener website. And if you look on the left over here, you see workshop recordings. If you click on that, all the different workshops that have been recorded will show up. And this is the Growing Cool Season Vegetables one here that I have been talking about. But you can see there are quite a few wonderful workshops that you can download from there. And I'm sure that there are many other great links in this website that you can go to get additional information. Now I'm going to switch to a different website. This is the CA Garden Web at the UC. It's Agriculture and Natural Resources Division, and they have this vegetables site. And if you scroll down, you see this list of vegetables. You can click on any one of these vegetables and download a file that gives you growing instructions that are from the scientific research and real accurate information about how to grow these different vegetables. I was talking about doing research online for different things. And just to give you an example, if you type in floating row cover, you'll get all kinds of hits. And here was one from the Wisconsin division of their university extension with all kinds of information about floating row covers and how to use them. So, I just tried to give you a little taste of the different options that you have. But if you do a little research and you look at these other extension services all over the country, you're going to find all kinds of additional detailed information about how to do these things. This is the Johnny's site with their planning tools and calculators, and you can go in here and go online and actually interactively type in your frost dates and get planting date suggestions for different crops. This is the IPM site that I didn't mention, but this is the integrated pest management. So if you have any problems with pests in the garden, this is a great resource also. So there's a lot out there that you can find when you do your own research that's going to help you determine when to plant and what to plant and how to care for it properly. So just wanted to share that.
Great. And I've got some more questions. What's the best place to buy half circle over garden drip irrigation units?
Half circle over garden drip irrigation units. I'm not sure exactly what that is. I guess they would, I don't know if those are hoops that go over the top of the garden or something, but drip irrigation generally is lightweight tubing with holes in it, spaced either 8 or 12 inches apart, and you connect it to a larger pipe, like a 1/2-inch plastic pipe, and then connect that to a pressure regulator that's going to keep the pressure from bursting those lightweight plastic tubes. And then when you turn them on, they just drip consistently out of those spaced holes in the drip irrigation. There are a lot of places around here that sell drip tape and drip irrigation supplies. I know that Sierra Plumbing has a pretty exhaustive collection of bits and pieces and parts and tubing and so on. Peaceful Valley does. I think I know that Nevada County Farm Supply has drip irrigation supplies. So I think that you can probably go into any of the local vendors that sell this stuff and get specific answers about what they have available. And once again, if you do a little bit of research online, you can find out all kinds of different information and articles and papers about appropriate irrigation for different crops and different environments. So I'm sorry if I don't know what the half hoop drip is, but
He says, yes, that's it. Hoops that are connected to hose and timers.
Okay.
And
Great.
she'll write in if you didn't quite answer the question with a follow-up. So we won't leave her unanswered.
Great. Thank you.
Another listener suggested for Lisa that A to Z would have the supplies. And
Yeah.
that,
there are a lot of
many
suppliers. There are a lot of garden centers and hardware stores and so on around here that are going to be able to help you out.
And Lisa says now, your answer was perfect. So thanks, Lisa. I'm glad we got that. Here's another question. Any suggestions for planting at appropriate times when my beds are still full of producing crops?
Okay. There's the rub, right? That's the problem. It's like, oh, I still am getting tomatoes. I don't want to pull them out. Well, it's interesting. Sometimes you have to bite the bullet and say, well, they're just not producing as much or as well as they were, and make a decision and say, we're cutting them down and we're planting something else. But I've read in a number of places people experimenting with starting the next crop before removing the previous one, especially as many, I shouldn't say most, but many of the small local farmers here and around the country are beginning to move toward a no-till practice, which means you're not even pulling the plants out of the ground when they're done. You cut them off and you leave their roots to rot and to add to the organic matter that's in that bed. You're also not turning the bed deeply. You're only turning it maybe a couple of inches just to mix in whatever amendments and compost and so on you're adding. So in that kind of a situation, you can actually start to plant the next crop while the original crop is still in the ground. So maybe if you have a row of tomatoes that are spaced 24 inches apart, and it's a single row down the middle of a bed, you start planting whatever it is you're going to grow in there next while the tomatoes are still producing. And then when you make the decision to take those tomatoes out, instead of tearing up the biological ecosystem that's going on in the bed, you just cut the tomato vine off above the ground, remove the detritus, and now your next crop is already on its way.
Great. All right, Tom asks, okay, he and I have been finessing the question a little bit, so let me just go through. He says, any comments on how to evaluate potting soil? He means for both seed starting and for growing, and not just potting soil, but soil amendments in 50-pound bags for containers and raised bed plants. So again, he's asking how to evaluate those products.
Yeah, that's kind of tough. The soil you're going to use for seed starting is different from the soil you're going to use for potting up or container growing. So that's the first thing. Most people are using a soilless mix for seed starting. The reason being that it's going to be sterile or close to sterile, so you're going to avoid that damping off and fungal problems that you might get from a regular potting soil. And it's also made up of finer material so that the seeds are not struggling as hard to push through the soil to get to the surface. So a seed mix is going to be a completely different animal from your potting soil. I just read an article today about an effort to start moving away from peat moss, which is a really primary component in most soilless seed starting mixes. And so there are experiments going on. North Carolina University in particular is experimenting with different soilless mixes for seed starting. But I have used over-the-counter seed starting mixes quite successfully. I try to go, I'm an organic farmer, so everything I buy is organic. I encourage you to do the same. When it comes to potting soil, I really don't know. Honestly, I don't know the answer. I don't know how you judge, except to experiment with different soils and look at what's in them also. Read the ingredients on the bag and see what the contents are. Because you want to have a potting soil that has some good stuff in it, that has some of the bat guano or chicken manure or other things that are going to make it actually provide some nutrient value to the plants. If it's just topsoil that they scraped off somebody's backyard and threw in a bag, you're not going to have much luck with it. So maybe sticking with the brand names. I don't know how to advise you on that other than trial and error, honestly. And usually you pay for quality. So I would be wary of super cheap, imported potting soil. Once again, I think you can probably go to a lot of the garden centers around here, because most of them carry a whole variety of different potting soils, and you can ask them what the characteristics are of each one and what would be appropriate for what it is that you're growing.
Great. Tom says, thank you.
You're welcome.
That was really interesting. I would second asking the garden centers here in Grass Valley and Penn Valley in our area. The folks there are knowledgeable. They've been selling these products to, our local gardeners for a long time. They will tell you what's working for our neighbors. So some more questions. Let's see. Ron, one of our master gardeners who's here, adds to your comment about, he says, he's adding to the comments about how do we plant more plants when they're already full of plants. And he says, so we can think of the new crop as companion planting, which is,
there you go.
Let's see. Pat wants to know what materials are best for making a raised bed.
Well, so you don't want to use a wood that's going to disintegrate rapidly. So fir, pine, all of those are not good choices because they will rot pretty quickly. In spite of the fact that some of the new pressure treated lumbers are considered non-toxic, I do not like to put chemicals in my garden bed, not knowing exactly what they are. And they still use coppers and other things so I would stay away from pressure treated. Cedar is a really good choice, and you can buy milled cedar locally at some of the sawmills here. And you can get, if you buy it from a mill, you can get cedar that is full dimensional lumber. So it's rough and it's going to be a full 2 inches, not an 1.5 inches. So that's how I made my raised beds. I used, I think it was 2x10 cedar boards, and used cedar 4x4 posts in the corners and in the centers to tie them together, and just big lag screws to hold it all together. If you're making a raised bed, in addition to, obviously there are some other woods that are very expensive that you could use that won't rot, but cedar is probably your best, most economical wood that's not gonna disintegrate over time. And I would also suggest that if you're building new beds, you get some hardware cloth and lay it at the entire bottom of the bed. If you have any problem with voles, moles, gophers, ground squirrels, and so on, you can protect at least the bottom of the bed from incursion by attaching a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch hardware cloth along the entire bottom side of the bed before you put it in place.
Okay, thank you. This may be our last question. Brian asks, what's the easiest way to design a drip irrigation system when plants have different water needs?
Well, I mean, normally when you're doing a drip irrigation system, you're going to be running a drip tape in each bed, separately in each bed. So presumably, you're going to have a bed that maybe has lettuce in it, or a bed that has tomatoes in it, or a bed that has cucumbers in it, something like that. And when you put the drip irrigation system together, instead of just connecting the tubes with open connectors, you can put valves in at each location where the drip tape connects to the main tube. So that allows you to open and close specific beds in order to, give maybe the cucumbers need a little extra water. And so you're going to open the cucumber valve and close everything else and let that run for an extra hour or so. But yeah, it's, essentially, I think the best thing to do is get a piece of graph paper or take your garden map and figure out, what's growing where, and lay out your irrigation system the same way that you, put down your plant information, and just figure out where is your water source, how many beds do I need to put irrigation in, how am I going to route the water from the source to the beds with the tubing, and then how many drip tapes do I need in each bed? So for instance, if you're doing tomatoes, you may want to just have a single drip tape or two drip tapes that are on either side of the tomato plants going down the center of the bed. If you're doing lettuce, you may want to have 4 drip tapes going down in between each row of lettuce in a bed where you have, say, 5 or 6 rows of lettuce side by side. So, and there's nothing that says you can't change that from season to season. These aren't permanent things. You can just pick up that drip tape, and if your beds are a standard size, you can actually create little manifolds that you can move from bed to bed. As you move your lettuce from one bed to the next, you can use the same manifold and drip tape in a different bed the next year. So standardizing bed size is a really good idea for things like that.
That's great. That's interesting. Yeah, if they're all the same, then it's just cookie cutter, one thing moved to the next one. That's neat. Wanted to mention that we do have a workshop coming up next month on March 12th on functional irrigation, and we will explore the mysteries of drip systems and pressure management and those sorts of things. So that will be another opportunity for you to hear from one of our master gardeners about that. Another comment from Ron about going back to packaged soil mixes. Tom is still here, so this one's for you, Tom, and everybody else. Ron writes, regarding packaged soil mixes, we have seen a variability in how hot the soil is based on, number 1, how fresh it is, package date, number 2, how long it has been stored in the sun, and number 3, the manufacturer. Also, what time of year the soil was packaged. These are comments that were learned from experience. We prefer recent package dated mixes as opposed to older packages. And I'll just add that it's so funny this comes up now because I was just looking at 3 bags of potting mix that I bought at the end of the summer last year, and they're stored under my house. And I was looking at them yesterday and thinking, I wonder if those are going to be just kind of dead after sitting over the winter. So do you want to comment maybe on that? aspect of how long can you keep a bag around before it's really just time to eat the $12 and get another one.
Honestly, I don't know the answer. I think Ron probably knows more about this than I do. And I would take his advice to heart. I didn't know, honestly, I've never looked for the packing date on potting soil. I buy it in bulk and assume that it's fresh when I'm buying it. But that's really, really interesting comments from Ron, and I would follow his advice. And yeah, if it's ancient, let's face it, it's not going to be as vibrant as it was. Whatever was alive in it may be cooked by the time you open it up. I wouldn't throw it away. I would just mix it in with the next batch. And who wants to throw away a $12 bag of potting soil?
I can just sprinkle it around the existing gardens as a little bit of mulch and amendment, so it won't go totally to waste. But maybe I wouldn't use it for starting seedlings this year.
Yeah, and I just saw Ron's comment about the mycorrhizae in the soil, and obviously, I mean that whole biological activity that's taking place in good soil is not going to thrive in a bag that's sitting in the sun or has been sitting for a long time with no adjacent soil or moisture or air to help it. So you're probably looking, like you said, you're probably looking at dead soil. That doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It may have good tilth. It may have good other ingredients, nutrients that are helpful, but it certainly is not going to have the good biological activity that you're looking for in a more recently packaged soil. So, yeah, I think Ron knows what he's talking about.
Well, you know what? I think we've come to the end of our questions. Folks are probably eager to get out there in the sunshine and put some of these ideas to work. I want to thank you, Rob. I know you put a tremendous amount of time, and your experience and your knowledge are all really reflected in this presentation. It was terrific. I hope we can have you back next year. We'll
thank you. Thank you to everyone who came zoomed in today, and hopefully we'll all be able to get together in person sometime soon. It's much more fun to see everybody. So thank you very much.